The night did not begin cruelly. Cruelty rarely announces itself. It arrived instead beneath chandeliers, draped in silk and civility, smiling as though it belonged. The ballroom of Ashcombe House glowed with 1,000 candles, their light trembling against gilt mirrors and polished marble, while music drifted like perfume through the air. Ladies moved in constellations of color, gowns whispering secrets as they passed. Gentlemen stood in dark clusters, appraising, comparing, deciding fates with a tilt of the head. It was a night designed for triumphs, yet some were invited only to witness them. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb stood at the edge of the room, precisely where the warmth of the candles failed to reach. Her gown was modest, pale blue and carefully mended, chosen not to dazzle but to avoid remark. She held herself with practiced stillness, hands folded, expression composed, as though invisibility were a skill she had mastered rather than a sentence imposed. Conversations curved neatly around her. Eyes slid past her shoulder. When her name was spoken, it was softened, lowered, trimmed of consequence. She had come, as she always did, because refusal would have been noticed, and notice of any kind was a danger. As a distant relation with no fortune and fewer allies, Eleanor existed by courtesy alone. She belonged nowhere fully, and everyone knew it. Pity, when offered, arrived sharpened with amusement. From her position, she could hear the music falter as partners changed, the scrape of shoes, the murmured assessments. She caught fragments of herself in those whispers. Too plain. Too quiet. Such a burden to her aunt. Poor thing. Destined to linger. Each phrase landed gently, like snow, until the weight became unbearable. Then laughter rippled, bright and contained, the sort shared among those certain of their safety. Eleanor did not need to look to know its source. She felt it in the way the room tilted, in the sudden attention that brushed her skin. A group of young ladies stood near the refreshment table, cheeks flushed with triumph and wine. One of them leaned forward, eyes gleaming with inspiration that had nothing to do with kindness. "Well," she said, not softly enough, "if Miss Whitcomb is so determined to be useful, perhaps she might oblige us." Another voice followed, honeyed and sharp. "Yes, she might dance." "With whom?" came the question, already answered by the pause that followed. Eleanor's breath stilled. She knew that pause. Everyone did. At the far end of the ballroom sat a man apart from the evening. He occupied a single chair near a marble column, untouched by candlelight, dressed in black so severe it seemed to absorb the glow around him. He did not converse. He did not watch the dancers. His posture was straight, his stillness deliberate, as though motion itself were a concession he refused to grant. A faint scar traced the line of his cheek, catching light only when he shifted, which was rarely. No one approached him. Mothers redirected daughters without explanation. Gentlemen nodded from a distance and moved on. His presence was a quiet discomfort, like a storm cloud lingering on a clear horizon. "Why not him?" the First Lady continued, amusement blooming. "It would be charitable." The word charity struck Eleanor like a slap. Heat flooded her face, then drained away, leaving a strange calm behind. She felt the room watching now, openly, eagerly. The dare hovered between them, fragile and cruel, waiting for her to collapse beneath it. Refusal would confirm every judgment. Acceptance would make her a spectacle. She understood the rules. She had always understood them. Slowly, she lifted her chin. The music shifted, a waltz unfolding, intimate and relentless. Eleanor stepped forward, each movement measured, as though she were walking into deep water. The floor seemed to lengthen with every pace. Conversations stilled. The laughter died, replaced by anticipation tinged with fear. When she reached him, the man finally looked up. His eyes were not what she expected. They were steady, gray, observant without cruelty. Surprise flickered there, then something quieter, more dangerous in its gentleness. He rose at once, bowing with formal precision, as though her presence were not an insult but an honor. "Miss," he said, voice low, unadorned, carrying only to her. "Are you certain?" The question, offered without judgment, unraveled something tight in her chest. She inclined her head. "I am." He extended his hand. His glove was warm. The touch was careful, restrained, as if he understood the weight of being seen together. When they stepped onto the floor, a murmur followed them like a tide pulling back from shore. As they moved, the room receded. Eleanor became aware of the cadence of his breathing, the controlled grace of his steps. He danced not with show but with purpose, guiding her as though this moment mattered. The music swelled. Whispers turned uncertain. She sensed it before she understood it, a subtle shift, like a crack forming in glass long believed unbreakable. Faces once gleaming with mockery tightened with calculation. Older guests stared outright, troubled not by her audacity but by his composure. He had not rebuffed her, nor humiliated her. He had accepted, and in rising, altered the room. Eleanor felt consequence ripple outward, touching every watching soul. Whatever game they intended was no longer theirs to control. Somewhere beyond the chandeliers and polite applause, something older than gossip had awakened. The man beside her moved with quiet authority, as though he had stepped from legend rather than rumor. Eleanor did not know his name, only that the distance between them had vanished, and the room now held its breath. It was not fear she felt then, but the first trembling hint of irreversible change beginning now quietly. The applause that followed the dance arrived late, hesitant, like rain unsure whether it was permitted to fall. It scattered across the ballroom in polite fragments, quickly smothered by conversation that surged too loudly, too eagerly, as though sound itself might erase what had just occurred. Eleanor felt the change at once. Where mockery had lived, uncertainty now took root. Eyes lingered where they once slid away. Smiles tightened, recalibrated. She and the man in black had not merely danced, they had unsettled an arrangement long accepted as fixed. He escorted her to the edge of the floor and released her hand with the same care he had offered it. "Thank you," he said, inclining his head. There was no flourish, no attempt at charm. Gratitude, plain and unguarded, sat between them like a fragile object neither wished to drop. Eleanor managed a nod. Words deserted her, replaced by the strange awareness that she had crossed an invisible boundary and could not return unchanged. Before she could gather herself, he stepped back into the shadows near the column, resuming his solitary vigil as though the dance had been a private interruption rather than a public rupture. She retreated to her former place along the wall, though it no longer fit her shape. Conversations followed her now, attaching themselves like burrs. She heard her name spoken without lowering of voices, speculation sharpening each syllable. Why would he accept? What could she have offered? Was it pity, or something worse? Eleanor stood very still, hands clenched, listening as her existence became currency once again. Yet something had altered in the room's rhythm. When she lifted her eyes, she found others watching him too, openly now, measuring the angle of his shoulders, the restraint of his expression. A gentleman murmured to another, confusion edging his tone. A matron frowned, unsettled by the memory of his flawless form. The man no one dared approach had moved with the authority of one long accustomed to command. It was then that Eleanor noticed the token. It lay on the small table beside her, placed there without ceremony. A single white camellia, its petals unbruised, impossibly fresh amid the heat of the ballroom. She stared at it, pulse quickening. She had not seen him leave his place. She had not felt anyone brush past her. Yet there it was, unmistakable, its meaning quietly undeniable. Her fingers hovered before touching it. Flowers were offered openly, with witnesses, with intent declared. This was different. This was a gesture meant to be found, not displayed. She closed her hand around the stem, heart racing with a treacherous warmth she did not trust. Across the room, laughter flared again, sharper this time. One of the young ladies who had issued the dare leaned toward her companions, eyes bright with triumph that curdled swiftly into irritation. "Did you see?" she said. He rewarded her. Rewarded, another echoed. Or marked her. The word slid through the air and found its mark. Eleanor's breath caught. She sensed the shift from ridicule to accusation, the subtle turn of society's blade. What had begun as sport threatened now to become scandal, and scandal demanded a culprit. Aunt Margaret appeared at Eleanor's side, lips thin. "You have been reckless," she murmured, not unkindly, but without defense. People will talk. They always do, Eleanor replied softly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Her aunt glanced at the flower in her hand and stiffened. Where did that come from? Eleanor said nothing. Explanation would invite interrogation, and interrogation would lead to conclusions she could not bear. The evening pressed on, though its earlier brightness had dimmed. Dances resumed, but the waltzes felt hurried, glances distracted. Eleanor did not dance again. She remained at the edge, camellia hidden within her glove, feeling its presence like a secret pulse against her skin. He did not approach her. That restraint, more than anything, fed the rumors. Had he lingered, they might have dismissed the moment as folly. His absence transformed it into intention. Servants whispered. Guests speculated. Names were quietly tested against his silhouette, then discarded with unease. Whoever he was not what he had been assumed to be. As the final notes of music faded and cloaks were gathered, Eleanor prepared herself for the long journey home, for the questions that would follow, the disapproval that would settle like dust upon her shoulders. She turned, intending to leave unnoticed, and nearly collided with him. "I beg your pardon," he said, stepping back at once. For a moment they stood too close, the scent of winter clinging to his coat. "I wished to return this." He held out her glove. She had not realized it was missing. Her fingers trembled as she took it, aware of the eyes that tracked the exchange. His gaze did not waver. "You owe me nothing," he continued quietly. "But the room will insist otherwise." "Then I suppose we are both indebted to rumor," she replied, words escaping before caution could stop them. A faint smile touched his mouth, gone almost before it appeared. "Rumor is a poor creditor," he said. "It collects without mercy." Their shared glance lingered, a fragile bridge spanning a widening gulf. Then he bowed and turned away, leaving Eleanor standing amid the murmurs he had named. By morning, she knew, the story would have sharpened, her name carved into it with careless hands. She would be blamed for what she did not understand and punished for what she had not sought. Yet as she stepped into the cold night air, camellia pressed to her heart, she felt the scandal gathering like thunder and sensed, beneath it, a quieter truth forming. Whatever he was, whatever power lay hidden behind his silence, he had chosen to see her. And that choice, once made, could not be unmade without consequence. The invitation arrived without seal or signature, delivered by a footman who did not meet Eleanor's eyes. It requested her presence the following afternoon at the conservatory adjoining Ashcombe House, phrased with impeccable courtesy and no explanation. Eleanor read it twice, pulse quickening, then folded it away as though it might burn her fingers. By morning the whispers had already taken shape. She heard them in the pause before her name, in the studied politeness of those who addressed her. Scandal had not yet struck, but it hovered close enough to taste. The conservatory was quiet when she arrived, its tall windows misted by winter breath. Pale sunlight filtered through glass panes, illuminating rows of dormant plants and the faint dust suspended in air. A fire burned low in the hearth, its warmth restrained, like the room itself. Eleanor removed her gloves slowly, grounding herself in the ritual. Whatever awaited her, she would meet it standing. He emerged from between two marble columns, as though he had been part of the room all along. Gone was the severe black of the ballroom. Today he wore dark gray, softened by the light. His expression remained guarded, yet something in his eyes shifted when he saw her, relief flickering before discipline smothered it. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I feared you might not." "I considered it," Eleanor replied, honest without being unkind. "But unanswered questions are rarely merciful." He inclined his head, accepting the rebuke. For a moment neither spoke. The fire cracked softly, punctuating the distance between them. "You have been discussed," he said at last, voice measured. "More than is fair. I am accustomed to it. That does not make it right." The words settled between them, heavy with intention. Eleanor studied him then, really studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the restraint in his hands. This was not a man unused to command, but one who had chosen silence at great cost. "You owe me no defense," she said gently. "I knew what would follow." "And yet you danced," he replied. "Why?" The question was not an accusation. It was an opening. "Because humiliation loses its power when faced willingly," Eleanor said after a pause. "And because you looked lonelier than I felt." Something in him shifted at that. He turned toward the window, gaze fixed on the pale sky beyond. "Loneliness," he murmured, "is a skill one acquires early." He spoke then, not in confession, but in fragments, offered carefully. Of a title inherited too young. Of expectations that crushed rather than elevated. Of a betrayal that had stripped trust from his blood and left him wary of every smile. He did not name names. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply allowed the truth to exist between them. "I withdrew," he said. "Not because I was ruined, as they suggest, but because I refused to perform." Eleanor listened, heart aching with recognition. "They mistook silence for weakness," she said. "They often do." Her own words followed, quieter still. She spoke of being surplus, of living by permission rather than right. Of learning to make herself small so others might feel large. The fire burned lower as her voice steadied, as though the room itself leaned closer. "I have spent years apologizing for my presence," she said. "Last night I stopped." He faced her then, eyes intent. "And in doing so, you reminded me of something I had forgotten." "What is that?" "That dignity is not granted. It is claimed." The air between them tightened, charged with what neither dared name. He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that Eleanor felt the warmth of him, the careful control holding him in check. "There is something you must understand," he said. "Proximity to me invites consequence. My name carries weight you do not yet comprehend." "I am already bearing consequence," she replied. "At least let it be for something real." Silence fell, profound and fragile. His hand lifted, then stilled, hovering near hers before retreating. The restraint was its own confession. "I would not see you harmed," he said softly. "If you wish to distance yourself now, I will not stand in your way." Eleanor met his gaze, heart pounding. "And if I do not?" A shadow crossed his face, part fear, part longing. "Then nothing remains unchanged." The truth of it resonated through her. Whatever lay ahead promised upheaval, revelation, perhaps ruin. Yet as she turned to leave, the weight of his unspoken name pressed against her thoughts. She sensed that his silence masked not disgrace, but a power withheld by choice, and that when it emerged, it would redraw every line she believed fixed. The reckoning arrived beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Harrington Assembly Rooms, where London gathered not to forgive, but to observe. Chandeliers blazed overhead, their light unforgiving, revealing every flaw, every whisper poised to become verdict. Eleanor entered on her aunt's arm, spine straight, breath measured, already aware that she had crossed the threshold from curiosity into cautionary tale. Conversations faltered at her passing, then resumed with sharpened interest. She felt their weight settle upon her shoulders, heavy with expectation. The scandal had ripened quickly. In drawing-rooms and carriage rides, her name had been bound to his with a confidence that stunned her. Some spoke of her ambition, others of her impropriety. None spoke of her courage. Tonight, she knew, would decide whether she emerged diminished or destroyed. She did not see him at first. That absence unsettled her more than his presence ever had. The orchestra tuned, chairs filled, and still the man in gray did not appear. Eleanor's pulse quickened, doubt threading through resolve. Had he chosen distance after all? Had prudence prevailed? Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened. He entered without flourish, yet the room shifted instinctively toward him. Conversations died outright. Heads turned, bodies angled, attention drawn as if by gravity. He wore formal black once more, but tonight it did not absorb the light, it commanded it. There was no mistaking him now. The posture, the bearing, the authority that bent the air around him announced what rumor had failed to name. Recognition spread in waves, astonishment following disbelief. Someone gasped softly. Another whispered a title, scarcely daring to give it voice. Eleanor felt the realization strike her not as shock, but as alignment. Of course. The restraint, the loneliness, the quiet command. The man no one dared approach had never lacked power. He had merely refused to wield it. He crossed the room with deliberate pace, ignoring the murmurs, the startled bows, the sudden deference blooming where disdain had lived. When he reached Eleanor, he stopped, offering his arm with grave formality. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, voice clear enough to carry. "May I have the honor?" Every eye fixed upon them. Eleanor felt the moment stretch, taut with consequence. This was no private invitation. This was a claim made before witnesses who could not look away. She placed her hand upon his arm. They moved together toward the center of the room, each step an assertion. The orchestra, startled into obedience, struck the opening notes of a stately waltz. As they turned, Eleanor became aware of the transformation around them. Faces once smug now flushed with recalibration. Those who had dared her now watched, pale with the knowledge of error. He leaned close, voice low. "I did not intend to reveal myself thus." "Yet you chose to," she replied. "Yes," he said. "Because silence, in this instance, would be cruelty." The dance unfolded with measured grace. There was no spectacle in their movement, only certainty. When the final note faded, he did not release her. Instead, he turned, still holding her hand, and faced the assembly. "My lords and ladies," he began, and the authority in his tone stilled the room completely. "I am aware that my presence has provoked confusion. Allow me to relieve it." He named himself then, title and lineage spoken plainly, without pride yet without apology. A duke, long absent, long speculated upon, now undeniably before them. Gasps rippled outward, followed by a hush heavy with implication. "I have lived quietly by design," he continued. "Not from disgrace, but from distaste for a society that mistakes performance for worth." His gaze moved deliberately across the room, lingering where mockery had once thrived. "In recent days, I have observed behavior that confirms my choice. I have seen a woman subjected to ridicule under the guise of amusement. I have seen cruelty rewarded with laughter." Eleanor felt his grip tighten, grounding rather than claiming. "Miss Whitcomb owes no apology," he said. "If scandal exists, it is not of her making. Any consequence attached to her name is mine to bear." The declaration landed with unmistakable finality. The room shifted again, this time under the weight of correction. Whispers died. Faces lowered. Those who had once judged now found themselves judged in turn. He turned back to Eleanor, voice softening. "You were brave when bravery was costly. I would not see that courage punished." Emotion rose in her throat, sharp and unbidden. She had not sought rescue, yet here it was, offered not as charity but as acknowledgment. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then swelling, uncertain whether it celebrated him or absolved themselves. He did not bow. He simply waited, eyes on Eleanor. Later, when the crowd had retreated into uneasy politeness and the weight of scrutiny eased, he spoke to her once more. "What I have done cannot be undone." "I know," she said. "And still," he continued, "your choice remains your own." She met his gaze, aware that safety now lay open before her, paved with title and protection. Yet she also knew that accepting it without reflection would undo the very dignity she had claimed. "Then allow me time," she said quietly. "Not to decide what you are, but what I will be." A flicker of something like pride crossed his face. "I will wait," he said. "However long it takes." As he released her hand, Eleanor understood that the greatest risk had not passed. Power had been revealed, but intimacy had not yet been chosen. The world now watched her with new eyes, and the next step would be hers alone. The morning broke pale and deliberate, as though the world itself wished to speak gently. Mist clung to the gardens of Ashcombe, softening edges, muting colors, offering grace where judgment had lingered. Eleanor walked alone among the bare hedges, boots brushing frost, heart steady at last. The city behind her still murmured with speculation, but distance had thinned its voice. Here, the air asked nothing of her. She had been offered safety wrapped in grandeur, an answer many would have seized without pause. Yet the weight of that offer demanded honesty, not gratitude. She had learned painfully that dignity survived only when chosen freely. Footsteps approached along the gravel path, unhurried, unmistakable. He did not announce himself, yet she felt his presence settle beside her like a held breath released. He wore no title in his manner now, only quiet attentiveness. They stood in companionable silence, watching light climb the stone walls. At last, he spoke. "I have waited," he said, not as a plea, but as a fact. Eleanor turned to him fully, seeing not a duke, but the man who had asked if she was certain. "I am," she replied, and meant more than the moment allowed. She told him then of her choice, not framed as refusal or surrender, but as truth. She would not be sheltered as an ornament, nor elevated as proof of his benevolence. She would stand beside him only if she was first allowed to stand alone. The confession cost her breath, but it steadied her spine. He listened without interruption, eyes dark with something fierce and reverent. When she finished, he exhaled slowly, as though released from a long-held restraint. "Then you are precisely the woman I hoped you were," he said. There was no flourish in his words, only alignment. He did not promise ease, nor shield her from scrutiny. Instead, he offered partnership, unadorned and irrevocable. In that offering lay the true risk. Eleanor stepped closer, closing the remaining space by her own will. When their hands met, there was no audience, no wager, no cruelty left to conquer. Only choice. They did not speak of love, yet it moved between them with undeniable gravity. Beyond the garden, society waited, restless and recalculating. He would return to it changed, and she would enter it transformed. They walked back together toward the house, not as spectacle, but as equals. Inside, servants paused, sensing history pass quietly through familiar halls. Later, when doors closed and candles dimmed, he asked her to dance once more. There was no orchestra, only the soft rhythm of shared breath. She rested her head briefly against his shoulder, unafraid of being seen. For the first time, belonging felt earned, not borrowed. When the dance ended, neither rushed to let go. Outside, bells rang faintly across the city, marking an hour that would be remembered differently. Eleanor knew the world would test them. But she also knew she would no longer meet it bowed. As they parted for the night, his final words followed her like a vow. "Whatever comes," he said softly, "we face it awake." Eleanor smiled then, a small, resolute thing. She stepped into her chamber alone, yet unafraid. Beyond the walls, dawn strengthened, and with it, the certainty that love chosen freely was the rarest power of all. Sleep did not come quickly, but reflection did. She lay awake considering the fragile miracle of being chosen without being claimed. In another wing of the house, he too remained wakeful, staring into embers that refused to die. Power had always obeyed him, vulnerability had not. He understood now that loving her would require courage beyond command. Morning arrived again, brighter, insistent. London would soon demand appearances, explanations, declarations. Neither intended to hide. When Eleanor descended the stairs, servants greeted her with unstudied respect. Word had already begun its work. Some stories diminished her, others elevated her, but none erased her. She no longer required erasure to survive. They met again at breakfast, exchanging a look that carried more promise than vows. Plans were spoken of carefully, with room left for refusal. That courtesy bound them more firmly than obligation ever could. By afternoon, carriages lined the drive, messengers bearing invitations, inquiries, demands. The world pressed forward, eager to define what it could not control. Eleanor watched from the window, strangely calm. Whatever narrative followed, she would inhabit it fully. He joined her there, standing close enough to share the view. Together, they saw a future neither had been permitted to imagine alone. No choir heralded the moment, no proclamation sealed it. Yet something irrevocable had been set in motion. Eleanor reached for his hand again, not seeking assurance, but offering it. He accepted without hesitation. Outside, the city stirred, unaware that a quiet revolution had already occurred. For once, The wager had been wrong. The man no one dared approach had been reached, and the woman they sought to shame had rewritten the terms of her fate. Their story would not end easily, but it would end honestly. As sunlight flooded the corridor, Eleanor stepped forward to meet whatever followed, unafraid. He walked beside her, not ahead, not behind. And somewhere between silence and scandal, love had found its voice. It spoke not in grand declarations, but in sustained presence. That presence, once denied, now reshaped everything. Eleanor felt the truth of it settle, steady and unyielding. Whatever trials awaited, she would meet them awake. Not as spectacle, not as charity, but as herself. The future, once a threat, now opened like a door she chose to cross. Behind her, the past loosened its grip. Ahead, consequence and hope waited together. Eleanor drew a breath, stepped forward, and did not look back. In choosing love without surrender, she had finally claimed her life. And the world, astonished, would have to follow. Thus ended the wager, not with laughter, but with quiet triumph. The dance that began in shame had become a beginning. At last now.